Okay. Hi. I'm always a bit confused when I'm asked to talk about altmetrics in the context of an open access session at a meeting, and it happens fairly often. It's never clear to me exactly why the two seem so linked together. I think some of it is, we want to have an altmetrics session, so we got to put it in somewhere. And some of it is that a lot of the leaders in the world of altmetrics are also leaders in the world of open access. So, for example, PLOS, Public Library of Science, is a leader in both areas, so I think they get tied together a little. But in truth, metrics for journals are pretty much agnostic as far as the access model goes. And they're just as meaningful or just as problematic for a subscription journal as they are for an author-pays journal or really any other kind of journal. So, despite nearly 350 years of practice, we still do a fairly poor job of measuring the quality and impact of research papers and the work of individual researchers. Much of our system for determining funding, career advancement, things like that, revolves around one metric, the impact factor. And the impact factor is a reasonable, if somewhat flawed, metric for measuring the relative quality and importance of a journal. It is a terrible metric, however, for measuring the quality and importance of an individual paper or the work of an individual scientist. The good news is technology has progressed to a point where we can do better in sending out a bunch of print copies of a journal and not really knowing who is reading it. We can actually now track the life of each individual paper after it's been published. We can better understand how it's been read, how it's been used. And that creates a tremendous opportunity for new alternative metrics, or as they're called, altmetrics. These can give us potentially a much better sense of the value of research results and the work of a researcher, as well as an interesting ability to measure some things that we could never measure before. Before I go any further, I always like to give a bit of a caveat. The concept of many of these metrics is pretty new. There's a lot of experimentation going on. There's very little practical use of them as of yet. So much of what I'll talk about is theoretical, more about potential than any current use. I've spoken with a lot of representatives from universities, from funding agencies, and they're all really interested in these things, but as of yet, they're not really necessarily using them for any practical purpose. So why do we need metrics anyway? Clearly, the best way to make a decision about a researcher should be a thorough understanding of their research. You should interview their colleagues. You should read all their papers. You should read all the papers that cite their papers. You should dig out the real-world implications of their work and get a sense of the true impact. And that works really well if, one, you have a really deep level of subject knowledge, and two, you have an unlimited amount of time. Many decisions have to be made by non-experts. University administrators, grant officers, people like that can't be expected to analyze high-level research. Librarians have to make decisions about an incredibly broad range of research publications. Researchers often find themselves venturing into new fields. You go where your research takes you, and you very quickly need to get a sense of what's important, what's going on in this field, who does good work. Scale is the other driver for the use of metrics. So a good friend just went through the academic job hunt process. And as she was making the rounds, for every job she applied to, she was up against a minimum of 400 to 500 qualified applicants, around what she described as 35 to 50 superstar applicants. And the task of each search committee at each university was to decide which 5 applicants they were going to bring in for interviews. So while we know the best way to make these sorts of decisions is based on a deep understanding of the work of the individual, there's no practical way to get that done. Reading one paper from each applicant would pretty much be a full-time job for a grant application, job application, let alone reading someone's entire publication history. So we need relatively quick ways to triage a huge stack of papers down to a workable level where you can really start at that point on building that deep understanding. That's what you really want. Right now, a lot of this is done by the impact factor, which is a misuse. As a metric, it was not designed for this purpose. The impact factor has a lot of problems, but one of the biggest is that it limits our concept of impactful research. Citation is a good measure. In many ways, generally, a citation means that this current work could not have been done without the previously cited work. So it's a sign that one's research has inspired further research, and driving subsequent research is a valuable goal, but it's not the only reason we do research. The ultimate goal is really to benefit society, to broaden our knowledge, to improve our lives, and citation can only show us part of that picture, and only for particular types of research impact. So take, for example, a paper describing a new clinical practice. Now, these kind of papers are often poorly cited, but often very widely read, and one paper can change the way millions of people are treated. But you can't see that from the citation record because practitioners are caring for patients. They're not writing subsequent papers. Engineering is another area where citation can fall short. A lot of engineering research is based on problem solving rather than hypothesis-driven research. And once the problem is solved, there may not be a whole lot further research into it if it's a really good solution, and hence you may have fewer citations than you see in other areas. So we've reached a point of sufficient computational power, and in the era of big data, this sort of reductionist approach, forcing all decisions through one measurement, is archaic. And the key to really understanding altmetrics is not to think about creating just a replacement for the impact factor, but think instead about creating thousands of replacements for the impact factor, each customized to meet the needs of one individual or to answer one question. And these custom metrics for each stakeholder are really the upside of having this near unlimited number of ways to analyze this enormous amount of data. It's a really intriguing promise of altmetrics, but the downside is that you now have this fire hose of data and this overwhelming quantity of information. So I think that the current state of the field is really separating the signal from the noise. We need to be careful about what's being measured and what a metric's telling us. A lot of approaches that are currently being offered seem backwards from a scientific perspective. Rather than starting with a question and developing a methodology to best answer that question, there's a tendency to start with an answer and then try to retrofit that back to a question. So a metric is chosen because it's something that's easy to measure. And then the researcher or the company that's trying to sell it to you tries to convince you that it actually means something. Our brains like patterns. And through evolution, we've adapted to using pattern recognition to understand the world. So, the plant with leaves shaped like this tastes good. The plant with leaves shaped like this is poisonous. That big animal with the stripes and the sharp teeth, you should probably stay away from it. And Stephen Jay Gould wrote about this and the problems this presents to us because there's a natural tendency in humans to want to create stories, to take available data, to make sense of it by using it to show patterns that tell a story, even when the meaning behind that story isn't there. Put more simply, is this great quote from William Bruce Cameron. When we look at altmetrics or any other kind of metrics, we have to carefully examine the stories they tell us to understand the significance that they may or may not hold. As he said, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So if we're going to use a metric, we need to know whether it actually measures anything that we care about. What are the kind of things that are being measured? Probably the most important development is that we're moving from looking on a journal level to the level of the individual paper, this idea of article-level metrics. Remember, the impact factor is a journal metric, so the worst paper in a journal has the same impact factor as the best paper in that journal. But if you want to know about the work done in an individual paper, then you need to look at that paper rather than averaging it among its neighbors. Now, if nothing else comes from altmetrics, this mindset change is a really important gain. So right now, the groups doing altmetrics are taking this kind of kitchen sink approach and pretty much measuring anything that can be measured and then looking to sort out meaning. And that includes things like usage numbers for their articles, citations, activity on social networks, activity on social bookmarking sites, mainstream media and blog coverage, whether anyone has left comments on an article. And what most of these sorts of measurements have in common is that they're measurements of attention, not measurements of quality or importance. Quality and importance of researchers' work is not the only thing we want to measure, but it is one of, if not the core thing that we want to know. It's at the heart of decision-making for academia, for funding decisions, for hiring decisions, for tenure decisions. We know that the impact factor is a flawed way of addressing those questions, but many of the metrics here don't even try to address it. So, is there any real connection between the attention paid to an article and its quality? Is attention in any way related to real impact? So usage of articles can be really difficult to interpret, and popularity is not a direct proxy for quality. So 2 of the top 10 most read articles in the history of all PLOS journals are about depression. So does that mean these are really significant, really important studies about depression, or does that instead indicate that there's a lot of general interest in the world about the subject of depression? And those are both really valuable pieces of information, but they have different meanings and they offer different value to different parties. I'm hitting the wrong button there. So the company Altmetric puts out the list of the top 100 scoring articles using their metrics every year. The number one scoring article last year was about the secret experiments Facebook was conducting on its users to see if it could affect their moods by changing what was in their feeds. And that article represents kind of a perfect storm for altmetrics because, one, it's controversial, and two, it's about social media. Altmetrics generally lean very heavily on social media for measurements, and social media is subject to a great deal of navel-gazing in that researchers who research social media very often use social media to discuss their findings about social media. Article number 2 on this for the year was a fairly mundane paper about pigment, but when proofing the article, the authors and editors of the paper failed to remove a note to themselves asking, quote, should we cite that crappy Gabor paper here? The schadenfreude that this induced throughout the research world made the paper a sensation. Number 3 is a paper on diet. Fad diets, any kind of diet articles get a lot of attention. People want to be healthy. They want to know what to eat. And then number 4 is a now retracted article on reprogramming stem cells. Again, highly controversial, but not necessarily highly impactful since it's now been retracted. Taking this even further, attention metrics tend to have a bias toward the sensational and the weird. Attention tends to gravitate towards things that are out of the ordinary. A paper on sexual activity in bats has long been in the top 3 most read papers from all PLOS journals. Next to that is a fairly unimportant study about, but the researchers kept a line of fruit flies in complete darkness for 57 years, which is awesome, but the study wasn't that meaningful. Basically, they said, wow, nothing happened. Evolution takes a long time. But what was interesting is that the study, because it was kind of cool and interesting, got to the front page of Reddit, and in 1 week, the paper had 194,000 HTML views. For the record, it's still only had about 1,500 PDF downloads, which might tell you something. Other top papers from Altmetric include a study about dogs lining up with magnetic fields to go to the bathroom, a joke article from the BMJ's Christmas issue about chocolate, searching the internet for time travelers, and some speculation about James Bond. A lot of these new metrics are based on social media, and social media coverage of an article often can tell us more about an author's ability to network than it does about the actual experiments described in a paper. So how would an article from a researcher with a huge Twitter following perform compared to a researcher who's not on Twitter at all? Does a larger number of tweets about one article tell us that it's a better article than another one, or just that the author's better networked? Social bookmarking tools like Elsevier's Mendeley let researchers create store lists of papers for future reference. And if you look at the most bookmarked papers on Mendeley, you see that 7 of the top 10 are studies and commentaries on the literature itself rather than original works of experimental research. Now, it's hard to know if there's a connection here. Maybe people who like to use online tools for the literature are really interested in the literature itself. And another possibility is that what we're seeing is that articles like these are of really broad interest across many fields. So sites like this are going to favor even mundane generalist topic articles over the most important articles within specific areas. It's even unclear how well these metrics actually measure attention. There's a recent study that showed that most page views were meaningless. 55% of cases, a reader spends less than 15 seconds on a given web page. Articles with more shares don't get read any more attentively than articles that are less shared. So their conclusion was measuring social sharing is great for understanding social sharing, but using it to understand which content is capturing more of someone's attention is going beyond what the data actually tells you. It's clear we need to tread very carefully around how we use these new metrics. If you set up a metric to be used in a performance assessment, researchers will change their behavior to maximize their performance of that metric. So if we're basing a reward system on the amount of attention a project draws, then marketing suddenly becomes one of the most important areas that a researcher needs to spend a lot of time. And right now, we do ask researchers to do a certain amount of self-promotion. It's a means to an end, though. Raising awareness of the work hopefully increases its impact, and impactful research is the goal. But by rewarding researchers for doing the things that many of these alternative metrics measure, we instead make attention itself the goal, rather than the impact we are hoping to gain through attention. So by focusing on the means rather than on the end, we may end up favoring drawing attention to oneself over producing meaningful research results. So if attention metrics are a poor measure for quality of the research done, what are they good for? And I talked earlier about this idea of custom metrics, and we have to remember that there's more to the world than just funding and tenure review committees. But even so, thinking of different case studies, like if I'm a grants officer at a funding body and I have a limited amount of funding I can give out, I want to be sure I'm giving it to somebody who's a reputable researcher with a proven track record of doing research that moves the field forward. Here, citation count may be a useful metric, but it's much better to look at the individual papers that this person has published than the average citations from the journals in which they were published. If I'm a graduate student, maybe I'm overwhelmed by the enormous amount of papers constantly coming out in my field. I want to keep up with the literature. I know which journals are important, but maybe I'm missing something. I don't have time to sort through everything, so for that student, knowing which papers in the field are turning up in their colleagues' reading lists on a social bookmarking site like Mendeley could really provide an answer. There's also some real potential here for researchers to keep an eye on their own work. Research is really a reputation-based business, and researchers are really keen to manage and protect their reputations. Knowing what someone is saying about you and your work is of great interest, particularly if you work in a controversial field like climate change. If you're working in the development office of a university and your job is to bring in donations from the public, then citations don't really matter to you because the public isn't doing citations. That's what researchers are doing, and they're not making donations to you. But knowing what articles were mentioned in the media or have gotten a lot of attention on social media, it sort of gives you something to bring to the public and say, here's something really important being done at my institution, you should come fund us. And if you're a librarian, finding out what researchers are interested in and talking about what are they talking about with one another, maybe that can help steer you into new areas of acquisition and let you meet the researchers' needs before they even know that they have them themselves. And I'll stop here. I mean, to me, this is the real promise of altmetrics, these sort of customized data sets that can help us approve so many different approaches to different questions. Right now, I think it's still early days. I'm not convinced as of yet that we're measuring the right things or that altmetrics will really solve these sorts of problems that we see in terms of evaluating research quality and impact. But I think there's tremendous promise here, and it's definitely an area to keep watching. So, thanks.